how did you get into rock photography, or why did you get into rock photography specifically, John?
I think growing up in Berkeley and at that particular time period, I was just really into the local rock and roll. You know, Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company. These are all local musicians, and they weren't glamorized like they would eventually be. And it was, you know, it was a quick trip across the Bay Bridge to the Fillmore or to the Avalon Ballroom or the Great Highway where a lot of these concerts took place. And it was just the thing to do. And, you know, I'm a 17, 18-year-old kid without a care in the world and, you know, enough money in my pocket, you know, to take in one of these $10 concerts. And it was just an easy thing to do. And people were smoking weed and doing other things. And
It's the place to be.
it was all part of that whole scene.
Got it.
So, and as you got into the early 70s, it's like there was a concert every weekend somewhere. And it was just an easy thing to do. And I was just into the music. And
so being into the music, who would you say from that era were your favorites?
Jefferson Airplane.
Okay.
Eventually the Grateful Dead, and then I got really into them. So it's the ultimate cult band.
Okay, absolutely.
But I wasn't really carrying a camera in those days. I was just listening to the music, or I had a little Instamatic just to kind of document things. And then I started getting a little bit more serious about it, and the big name bands would come, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, and you really wanted to kind of take things more seriously. So, you know, I had pretty sophisticated equipment and access to stage, and not being a very tall person, sometimes I'm on my tiptoes looking over somebody a foot taller than me in front of me, and you're trying to get that angle where you can see the musician without having obstructions and everything. So it became a serious game, you know, and I kind of found myself viewing the concert through a camera lens instead of just sitting in my chair or standing and, you know, watching them on stage. And sometimes I would photograph for a certain period of time and then just kind of take it easy and listen to the music.
Okay, having looked at a lot of your work, I'm really interested in one particular picture, which is this one. And the reason I'm interested is, as I understand it, that was about the first festival of all.
Yeah.
Magic Mountain.
And you know
So you were at Magic Mountain?
Magic Mountain Music Festival was June of 1967. It was a 2-day show. My camera of choice was a Kodak Instamatic. And that is what I shot this picture of Jim Morrison with.
Wow.
My elbows, I remember, were on the stage looking up at him. And that's how close I was with that little tiny pocket camera. And looking back on it now, and there were so many other big name people on there. Well, Dionne Warwick, The Doors, Canned Heat, Jefferson Airplane, The Byrds, Country Joe and the Fish, you know, and to have had sophisticated equipment in those days, first of all, I couldn't afford it. You know, again, as a kid, I was 17 years old when I took this photograph.
Okay.
So everything has to start somewhere. But yeah, I do remember this, you know, pretty vividly.
Because Magic Mountain, as you know, it predated Monterey, it predated Woodstock. It was before all of the iconic festivals that we remember. Magic Mountain was kind of the first 2-day festival.
So that was on Mount Tamalpais in Marin County, and yeah, I was just there with my roommate, and we met a couple young ladies that we spent the day with, and us guys were into the music more than they were. And in those days, you could just mingle through the crowd. You know, there wasn't that intensity where you were kind of packed in like sardines, because it was all fresh. It was all low-key in those days.
So at that time, from the venues that you took photographs, were you working as an official photographer, or just a kid going to the show, or somewhere in between the two?
I very seldom was an official photographer. I was just a kid in the audience. And then later on, as I, developed a good portfolio of images, then I presented them to the people at Winterland, and eventually got a non-paying job, which basically gave me access to, the concerts free of charge. And the only thing I had to do was produce results. And it was fun. It was fun, and yet I had to deal with people with big egos, and some bands had their own photographer, and I would not be allowed backstage or on stage. So I did most of my photographing from the audience. I remember in the early 70s being invited to photograph a session, a private session with Dave Mason. So it was just me. I was the only one in the audience. It was a rehearsal. And so I was backstage taking pictures of Dave Mason, and his family were there. So during the leisure hours, and then during the rehearsal where they were actually playing, I did a real interesting shot where I took a double exposure of Dave Mason's head, and then I recocked the shutter without advancing the film, and then zoomed out, and I took a picture of his whole body, and I put his body inside his head.
Wow.
And it's a black and white shot that I'll show you at some point.
Cool.
And I did that a couple times, just an experiment, So, that was when I was kind of doing things on a somewhat professional level. But for the most part, I was just, just somebody out in the audience, capturing these great moments, which now are pretty much historic.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I look at some of the photographs now, like the photograph of Mick Jagger, 35th birthday, how young these people look. And unfortunately, a lot of the photographs I've taken are musicians that have passed on. And, those have a lot of, meaning to me. To see these people looking so young in the beginnings of their career. It's kind of neat. So I knew I'd been sitting on all of this, information all these years. And I never knew that I'd ever do anything with it. But I knew I had something.
Yeah.
And in 2007, I was exhibiting my artwork at the Sausalito Art Festival. And my girlfriend was the poster artist. And the festival wanted to look at the archives that I had, because it was the 40th anniversary of the Summer of Love. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to do a gallery show of a lot of my rock and roll photographs. And Jefferson Starship was playing that show. Country Joe was playing. So they had people, because it was a festive event. And I remember having people come into my booth that were musicians. David LaFlame from It's a Beautiful Day came into my booth and says, "Do you have pictures of me?" And I said, "Darn." He says, "I saw you when you were the opening act for Jefferson Airplane, but I never, photographed you. And he was a little disappointed, but it was a 50-50 chance he was going to get the answer he wanted. But to see people's reaction to these photographs, because it was a gallery setting that was probably 20 feet by maybe 100 feet, and it was like walking into a gallery at this art festival. So I had my landscape art in one section of the show, and then I had my rock and roll exhibit over here. And every so often I'd leave my booth and walk over to the rock and roll show, and I would kind of stand in the background and watch people as they would go from one photograph to another, and they would comment on it, and it brought back all of these memories, and people would comment, I was at that show. And to hear them talk about things and to bring up, you know, these experiences from, you know, 40 years ago. And this one black and white shot I have of The Who, this guy picked himself out of the audience. He says, that's me in the picture. And then, and at that time I wasn't selling the prints, but I had enough interest. And so I started selling a few here and there. And I took the profits and I donated the money to Neil Young's Bridge School. Cool. Because I wasn't really interested in profiting from it. To me, just being part of that whole situation was enough, you know, for me.
So how long a period of time were you a rock and roll photographer, and what brought about the transition? Because I know now you're far better known as a landscape photographer.
Decided I needed to make a living. That's pretty much it. And you know, you kind of go through phases in your life, and you say, okay, well, I think I've kind of accomplished everything I wanted to do there. Now I got to take life a little bit, you know, more seriously. And my love of travel and my camping trips to Yosemite and everything kind of sparked up the interest in being a landscape photographer.
Yes, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I spoke with Elliot Landy, who was the official stills photographer at Woodstock. Mm-hmm. And I said, what transitioned you out of being a musician photographer into portraits and other stuff? And he said, I just got bored of being side stage. He said, yeah. He said it just restricted him as a photographer. Mm-hmm. And he said, so I moved on for that reason. So I think it's interesting that what I see in the collection of pictures that you have is that because they were taken when they were taken, and they're now relatively 30 years ago, these are probably images that have not been seen very much, I suspect. We've all seen sort of the stock portraits of and the iconic shots of Dylan, Jagger or whatever, but yours stick out as being different because they haven't been seen.
The funny thing is, I hadn't seen these in years.
Oh, really?
I mean, I had like boxes of slides just in little banker's boxes, and they've just been tucked away, untouched. I probably hadn't seen any of these in 30 years.
Wow.
And then all of a sudden this event at the festival came up, and now I'm going through boxes of slides, and I have this big light table that looks like a tanning bed, and I had slides and print film laid out there, and I'd look at them under, you know, a loop, because I, you know, wanted to make sure everything was sharp, everything was in focus, and which was hard to do in those days because you didn't have autofocus cameras. I used to roll my own film, in fact. And you know, I had a few issues where, you know, I rolled my own film, and when I loaded it into the camera, it didn't quite catch. And I remember shooting a Beach Boy concert, and I'm thinking, I'm getting 70 exposures on this roll. I was shooting blanks the whole time. So, you know, that's why I never became a wedding photographer. You know, you don't restage something like that again. So, you know, again, to go down memory lane, and I would see things that I forgot that I had shot. I never knew I had a photograph of James Taylor. I just saw things that, And I would look on the slides and it would say what year they were taken. And when I finally decided to produce these images, the one thing that I think makes them unique is to be able to research the set lists, which you can pick up anything on the internet now. But to be able to say, you know, I know that this was taken in '74 and I know it was at the Oakland Coliseum Arena, and I would just key in that information, boom, there's the concert.
Right.
You know, there's the whole lineup of who else played on that. So that's what also makes these photographs unique, is to be able to pull up
because
the information on it.
It's not only the image that's setting it in time and space, you're setting it into its in context.
It's the complete package.
It's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when I see people going through my prints, I say, look on the back and you'll get a little bit more information. And that usually perks people up, because they're looking at the images and they're hopefully being entertained at what they see. But when I say look on the back, and you know, there's the rest of the information, that's what gets people excited too.
Absolutely, that's the thing that fascinates me about Grateful Dead fans, is that Grateful Dead fans are the only people I know that who will say to one another, 11/10/72,
yeah,
and they'll remember the show.
Sure.
No other band can quote it from date.
Oh sure. They were the ultimate cult band. They did something that was so unique. First of all, when you would go see them, you wouldn't just see one show. If they were playing 4 or 5 nights, you would see them 4 or 5 nights, because every single show was a completely different show.
Right.
They would have maybe a country format one night. They would have a rock and roll format one night. They even would have kind of a jazz, they would have musicians like Branford Marsalis, or the big man from Springsteen's band playing. And so they'd always have these guest musicians come and play with them. But what was so unique, and nobody has ever been allowed to do this at any other show, is they had a tapers section where people would come in with this sophisticated cassette recording equipment, and they would let you tape the shows. But there was a special tapers section, and it was always at the very back of the auditorium, directly ahead of where the band was set up. They didn't want you on the left side, they didn't want you on the right side, because they knew recordings were going to be out there. They wanted good quality recordings. And nobody has ever done that. And you would see these booms in the air with these, stereo microphones and everything. It was like going over through Palm Desert, where you see all the windmills, And it was the greatest thing. And that was one thing that, so-called deadheads were so famous for, is trading tapes.
Oh yeah.
People weren't doing it to make money, they were doing it to share the experience. So, like what you're saying is, someone would bring up a particular show, that maybe they saw at Red Rocks in Colorado, and they say, oh, did you see the show at up in Eugene, Oregon? They did, bring up any song, Scarlet Begonias, where they didn't go into Fire on the Mountain, they went into something else. Or they'd start with one song and then go through their whole concert, and then end, the encore would be the song they started with.
Right.
And they kept messing with you. They would kind of tease you with the melody of a song that you think it's going to be, and then they do a complete 180 and it ends up being a different song. So
cool.
They were the most fun to see, I think, where you went to every show.
I know amongst your collection that are all very iconic events, but I know you were at the Last Waltz. And the Last Waltz were you invited as a photographer to the Last Waltz?
I was invited, but I had to pay for my ticket. And nobody had ever spent $40 for a concert. This was 1976. It was Thanksgiving night. And I remember my mom said, you're going to a concert? You're not going to be here for Thanksgiving dinner? And I said, Mom, you wouldn't understand. and we kind of let it go at that. And we just heard rumors of who might show up. And they served Thanksgiving dinner for people. And it was just the most incredible thing. And so the band was playing, and every guest that would walk out, you would have the band as their backup. Well, it was not just that, but then they had the Berkeley Philharmonic Orchestra behind them, the Tower Power Brass section. So every song was a production. And when you listen to the CD or watch the DVD, I mean, you really, these musicians that came out to play, they were just so proud to be on stage. And when Neil Young came out, he says, before I start, I just want to say it's one of the pleasures of my life to be on the stage with these people. Direct quote. And there were things that I did not notice when I was there photographing that I noticed when I saw the DVD. Like when Neil came out and was singing Helpless, and Joni Mitchell was harmonizing, singing behind this curtain behind the stage. You saw the silhouette of her body, but you heard that distinctive voice. I didn't pick up on that.
Right.
But when she came out to play, she did a couple songs with Neil, and it's just the things that you pick up on later on. Or when Eric Clapton came out and he's doing Further On Down the Road, and just as he starts his guitar solo, his guitar strap comes unbuckled and his guitar dropped and he catches it. But Robbie Robertson, of the band, who is one of my absolute favorite guitar players, just picked it right up like nothing had ever happened. And you see this in the movie.
Right.
And so things like that I didn't see when I was photographing, because I'm viewing the show through a camera lens, and I'm not seeing the particulars that are going on. And a photographer can only be in one place at one time.
Absolutely.
So there was great shots that I got, and I'm sure a lot of opportunities that I didn't have.
I think you got some. I only recently had a chance to see your collection. I think you have a collection of amazing shots. I mean, I think they're significant in as much as they capture specific events. We've all seen a lot of images of the Last Waltz, but a lot of these have not been seen. I think they're significant from that level.
The Last Waltz was just. It was just an event that is indescribable. It's like being at an Academy Awards of musicians that you just, first of all, they were unexpected, but people, it's like you don't really know who the friends of, certain bands are. So, the band invited people that were part of, their existence, and like Ronnie Hawkins, I think before they became the band, they were called the Hawks. And he was funny. He was a lot of fun to see. So that was definitely one of the more memorable, events. And that was kind of towards the end of my rock and roll, era. But I was glad to have been there.
Yes. I think we all have a sort of spirit of events that we were at, that we kind of say, I was glad to have been there.
Oh, yeah.
I was a radio reporter at Live Aid in London, and I have no pictures of it, because I was working with a microphone in my hand all day, but I was glad to have been there. So that's what makes pictures significant, I think. It's time and space.
Yeah.
Remember the time.
Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah. Good stuff. Thank you.